Over the course of human history, there have been roughly 120 billion Homo sapiens drawing breath at one point or another on this earth. Each one has made their mark on the world in some way, shape, or form, whether that be through their genetic lineage of having children, fighting in a war over territory, building the infrastructure that their societies relied upon, or gathering food to feed their village, and the list goes on. The vast majority of these people have not been spoken about in history books. In fact, the vast majority of them have lived at a time before history ever even existed, as most people on Earth lived before the invention of writing. Even after the invention of writing and the rise of civilizations, the individual lives of the vast majority of people had sort of been meshed into numerous various groups. We've all heard of ancient Egypt, and most people would be familiar with the pharaohs, and many even familiar with some of the names of the most famous pharaohs. But outside of that, you probably couldn't name any particular ordinary ancient Egyptian farmer. How he walked and talked around his family or friends, or about his work life. That individual, ancient Egyptian farmer's life has been meshed in with the lives of other Egyptian farmers into a cohesive group that we now think of as an ordinary ancient Egyptian. The vast majority of people, after all, are ordinary. After all, that's what ordinary means. Kind of like everyone else. Going through many of the typical milestones that many people in various cultures go through, namely their childhood, a transition into adulthood, marriage, children, work life, etc., and eventually even death, which consumes us all. They may have lived constructive lives or deconstructive lives, or perhaps both at the same time. At the end of the day, by the time that their grandchildren passed away, their memories were forgotten, and their lives pretty much morphed into that of a collective tribe that they had lived under. However, there are a few people that pop up that stand out from the others for better or for worse. These people, who changed the course of human history more so than others. Some are religious figures, others generals, scientists, inventors, artists, philosophers, and others, who stand out by being exceptionally remarkable in one or more areas, who used their ability to end up changing the course of civilization, and in a way, the lives of all of those ordinary people that we don't remember the names of. For this reason, this asymmetry of influence, I'm going to cover some of the most influential people in history during the course of this series. I want to point out that while I'm talking about the most influential people, this doesn't necessarily mean that their influence has been overwhelmingly positive, or even a net positive. Many of these people are actually total pieces of shit, even by the standards of their time. Most of them would be considered pretty terrible by the standards of today, but that's not fair. I am going to be dedicating this video to ancient history, which roughly covers a period of time around the invention of writing, around 550 BCE, to the beginnings of the Classical Age. Nearly everyone in this video will be from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, as these had the earliest writing systems. There are probably very important figures from other parts of the world who I could have named, but since they weren't written down, I just don't know their names. I'm also going to avoid using legendary and mythological figures because they deserve their own video. So let's move on to the first guy or guys on the list. And this one is particularly strange. King Minos, or King Narmer, or King Scorpion. Yeah, the first person on this list is truly indicative of just how little we know about the past, given its scarcity of records. King Minos, or Menes, the pronunciation is difficult to know for sure, is someone we really don't know much about. He lived around 3200 to 3000 BCE. Again, that's a really long range because we don't know the exact date, and that's a pretty long swath of time. I'm pretty sure he didn't live to 800 years old. Regardless of this, he is most famous for uniting Upper and Lower Egypt into the first united dynasty, laying the foundations for one of the most influential and long-lasting civilizations in history. Outside of that, we really don't know much about him though. There are two other major figures in early ancient Egyptian history that just kind of mesh with this story. Those are of King Narmer and the Scorpion King I. Narmer was probably the same person as Menes, But going back that far in history, it's really hard to tell, as many of the stories just fall in line with those of King Menes' stories, namely the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. We really don't have enough stories to confirm this for good. Narmer's records note that there were a great deal of conquests into the Levant region of what is now Israel and the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. However, this doesn't show up in King Menes' records, so it's hard to tell if they were really the same person. There's also some evidence to suggest that the Scorpion King I may have been Narmer, but then again, Narmer could have been one of his successors. It's so far back in time that it's really blurred between these three people or names that might have been just one person. But it's fascinating that you have three major figures, larger than life figures, that are named and may have been the same guy, maybe two guys, maybe three guys. We really don't know. Another cool fun fact is that King Menes was most likely killed by a hippo. Next on the list is Khufu, who reigned from 2589 to 2566 BCE. You may be more familiar with his name, as he is the one who commissioned the Great Pyramids of Giza. However, it's worth noting that he obviously played no part in actually building it. I mean, let's keep it real, it was actually done by farm workers who were doing all the heavy lifting, literally. While the pharaoh probably sat on his ass and got all the credit for it. And he got a really nice place to store his corpse in after he died, so he can enjoy the afterlife, with all of his shiny gold things and pet cats. So while we don't know much about him outside of the pyramids, and obviously the pyramids were essentially a giant vanity project for him, it's still worth including him anyway, given the fact that the iconography of the pyramids is the most famous icon of the ancient world. It is also the only wonder of the ancient world that is still intact today and has captivated people for millennia, long after its completion. So I want to give Khufu credit where credit is due, even though he didn't actually do any of the work when it came to the heavy lifting or any of the architecture or engineering. He just waved a magic wand and told people what they should do. But props for the order. Let's move on to Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq and Syria. We'll get to Sargon of Akkad. He was the first conqueror in recorded history. Now obviously, this does not mean that he was the first conqueror. There were probably plenty of conquerors before him, but they didn't have any written writing system, and therefore we don't know their names. Written writing system? That's redundant. Anyway, sucks for them. Nonetheless, I would argue that Sargon's conquest was particularly impressive given the fact that he had to conquer not only a bunch of hunter-gatherers or chiefdoms, but actual city-states. Those city-states were those of Sumeria, the first civilized civilization, if you could call them that. That's redundant as well, but you get what I'm saying. The Fertile Crescent was the birthplace of human civilization, where farmers had produced a large enough surplus of crops to settle down in cities. These cities, like Uruk and Ur, had a great deal of complex legal systems, organized armies, and a whole bunch of other matters that we just take for granted today that weren't typical for the norm at the time. On top of that, they also produced a writing system called cuneiform, which involved basically putting in grooves into rocks, and these rocks survive to this day. That's why we know about Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was leading a Semitic group of peoples called the Akkadians, hence the name Sargon of Akkad, and they took over the Sumerian city-states. Sargon thought to himself, "Hey, that's a nice civilization you got there. It'd be a shame if someone took it from yous." However, while Sargon of Akkad was pretty good at destroying things, he was not really good at building things. He was really good at kicking asses, but he wasn't very good at building a great civilization afterwards. However, the same was not true for the next person on this list. Hammurabi. Hammurabi inherited the Babylonian throne from his father in 1792 BC, or BCE. I really don't care. While the Akkadians didn't really have much to offer other than being really good at tearing down stuff and stabbing people with sharp objects, the Babylonians, while also being very good at stabbing people with sharp objects, would be far more civilized in the aftermath of the war, or wars. What Hammurabi is most famous for is his code, one of the earliest legal systems in the world. Now keep in mind, this wasn't the first legal system, as the Sumerian civilization had one, but Hammurabi's code was unique in a handful of ways. This one didn't simply seek compensation for victims, it also sought punishment for perpetrators of crimes. And when I say punishment, I really mean punishment. This is where the phrase an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth comes from. It comes from Hammurabi's code, and if you think about it, it is kind of fair. If you pluck out someone's eye, maybe you deserve to get your eye plucked out as well. This gives Hammurabi's code a reputation for being extremely harsh and brutal. And it doesn't help the fact that a different set of punishments were given for slaves and freed people. Nonetheless, it didn't incorporate one of the most groundbreaking concepts in legal matters of all time, the presumption of innocence. This is oftentimes called innocent until proven guilty, or at the very least, innocent until proven not guilty. And it's the standard we still use today in common law. Next on the list is the first great woman of history, Hatshepsut, who reigned from 1478 BC to 1458 BCE. Originally Queen Regent, she eventually became a pharaoh herself, would oftentimes act like a man, given the fact that she was in a very male-dominated role. There aren't too many female pharaohs. This is part of the reason why she oftentimes is depicted with a beard to show masculine status. She is most famous for some of the most impressive temples and monuments in ancient Egyptian history. This made her quite popular with ordinary Egyptians. And while it is certainly true that ordinary Egyptians, who we don't know the names of, were the primary builders of these monuments, they certainly were impressed by the projects that she spearheaded. She did muster up the political will to organize people in order to build them to begin with. What's interesting is that after she died, there was a clear effort to destroy any mention of her legacy. However, it's difficult to tell whether this was done for political reasons or just because of misogyny, or in my opinion, a combination of the two. Let's move on to the list to Amenhotep III. I'm kind of surprised that this guy isn't a household name, because he's widely considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest pharaoh in history in terms of actually engaging in great leadership, not merely constructing a bunch of fancy monuments. Or for that matter, just whacking nearby people with a stick. He was very important in spreading ancient Egyptian influence to nearby civilizations. Through trade relationships and cultural exchange, ancient Egyptian culture spread towards the Fertile Crescent and other parts of the world. This cross-cultural exchange was really the first true fusion between two major civilized cultures, between that of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. Next on the list is Akhenaten, also known as the Heretic, who reigned from 1351 to 1333 BCE. He is probably my favorite on this list as far as this video is concerned, even though he wasn't a great leader. He's just fascinating. At this point, ancient Egypt was at the peak of its power. However, a peak is a peak because there's a downfall coming shortly afterwards, and that downfall is partially represented by Akhenaten. Akhenaten is known as the Heretic because he abandoned the Egyptian gods for one god, Aten. Yes, this guy pretty much invented monotheism, a form of monotheism that predates that of the ancient Israelites. Now, on one hand, this is a pretty brilliant idea because monotheism was novel at the time. On the other hand, there's a massive downside because monotheism pretty much means that you have to get rid of all the other gods, which means you have to stamp out the beliefs of pretty much everyone in your kingdom, which understandably pisses people in that kingdom off. Polytheists are oftentimes more tolerant than monotheists because they can just adopt a new god, but monotheists tend to be particularly intolerant. You have to pretty much cut up every other god out of the system. And having a guy in charge who basically tells you that all the gods you've been worshipping are just fairy tales, like some sort of Reddit atheist, just from the ancient Egyptian ages, probably pisses people off. So abandoning all of your Egyptian gods in favor of this one giant circle disc in the sky, who's sort of a sun but sort of not, doesn't go on too well. And you eventually saw the emergence of polytheism. Monotheism would not emerge again until the ancient Israelites, which leads us to Ramesses the Great, who reigned from 1279 to 1213 BCE. Yes, you can tell here that there are a lot of pharaohs on this list. He reigned at the peak of Egyptian imperialism. The ancient Egyptians were not particularly famous for being a conquering group of people, and honestly, looking back at this from a modern standpoint, I kind of have to give them credit. They didn't like conquering people too much, however Ramesses the Great was the exception. He spread the Egyptian Empire into the Levant and what is now Israel and the Palestinian territories, along with Lebanon and parts of Jordan and Syria. The reason being is that another power was rising in the area, and that power was the Indo-European group called the Hittites, located in what is now Turkey. This resulted in the Battle of Kadesh, which is on the Lebanese-Syrian border, and the first recorded battle in human history. Obviously, this was not the first battle, as there were plenty before, but it was the first battle in which we have a written record of people who lived through it. It doesn't necessarily mean that their accounts were accurate. In fact, the vast majority of their accounts were bullshit, because most of the evidence points out that while both sides claimed victory, the reality was that it was more of a stalemate, and the powers just kind of collapsed during the Bronze Age collapse. Ushar Biapold, of whom I'm terribly mispronouncing, is next on the list. He reigned from 669 to 631 BCE. You know who didn't collapse during the Bronze Age collapse? The Assyrians. You might be familiar with them if you've ever played Civilization V. These guys are quite fond of using siege equipment to burn down your cities, and this is actually quite historically accurate. In fact, I would say that Civilization as a video game is a more accurate depiction than a Hollywood movie. Now, his reign certainly engaged in your typical Assyrian affairs of mass ethnic cleansings and what we would consider today to be colossal war crimes. Just look at his extermination of many of the Elamite tribes. But nonetheless, he didn't just kill people, he also killed lions. But when he wasn't killing humans or lions, he actually commissioned countless pieces of public artwork and the Library of Ashur. This library was one of the most impressive collections of cuneiform texts in the world, and given that these were written in stone tablets, they are preserved remarkably well compared to those written on paper, let alone tweets and digital stuff. And this is part of the reason why we know so much about ancient Mesopotamia. Next on the list is Nebuchadnezzar II. From 605 to 562 BCE, his father was a brutal conqueror, creator of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, who crushed the Assyrians and was quite fond of using the brutality of the Assyrians against the Assyrians. While his father mostly led through conquest and terror, Nebuchadnezzar was also a little bit more complex. He commissioned the construction of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which unfortunately does not exist today like the pyramids. Nonetheless, he is quite notorious to anybody who is quite familiar with the biblical narrative, as he is famous, at least in the Western world and the wider Christian world, for destroying Jerusalem, and in turn destroying the kingdom of Judea. As a result, the elite Jews were sent to captivity in Babylon. However, a remarkable thing happened during that time period. Rather than adopting the Babylonian gods, the elite Jews became monotheistic at the time, and started practicing what they called monotheism, not just monolatry, the belief in many gods but worshipping one god, but rather only worshipping one god and only believing in one god, which was quite remarkable and goes back to Akhenaten. This would set the foundations for the Abrahamic religions in their current form. Last on the list is someone who is a quasi-historical yet quasi-legendary figure. We really don't know whether he existed as a person or was an amalgamation of different people, but I thought I'd include one person from Europe anyway, given that the fact that the next video is on the classical age, and that person is Homer. Homer is a bit of an honorable mention. He is the author of the Iliad, which is about the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, which is about the character Odysseus, one of the heroes of the Trojan War returning back home. He in many ways is the first great author of Western history, if you could call it Western or history, or you could even call him an author given the fact that we don't really know if he existed. If he did live, he lived during the 8th century, long before the Golden Age of Athens or the famous battles of Sparta, let alone Alexander the Great. And this means that the people who lived during those heroic times of ancient Greece, the Golden Age of Athens, etc., looked to Homer's writings and his epics as history, even though much of it was pretty much legend and perhaps mythology. While we know that there was a city of Troy, if there was a battle, it probably was less over, say, squabbling of the gods or a love affair between Paris and Helen, but rather a fight between Greek city-states and Troy over maritime straits, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Nonetheless, his story would inspire the Romans to adapt their own origin story, claiming that they were descendants of the survivors of the Trojans. Keep this in mind. Homer had this impact despite the fact that we really don't even know if he existed. And That's kind of impressive, creating such an impact when you're arguably a fictional character or a quasi-fictional character. And that's how I'm going to end this video. Thanks for watching, and keep in mind in the future we'll go back in time to the classical age. Thanks for watching.